It was supposed to be just another relic from the past, but what William discovered inside his mother's jewelry box shattered everything he thought he knew. He had walked into the quiet halls of Althorp with the weight of duty on his shoulders, expecting nothing more than a ritual visit to honor the memory of the woman the world adored yet whom he still called Mom. The air inside was thick, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and dust, the kind of stillness that holds its breath when you enter. William had visited countless times before, but this time, something drew him to a corner of the room no one seemed to notice. There, under the muted light filtering through heavy curtains, sat a small velvet-lined jewelry box, its edges softened by time, its clasp just barely holding shut. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, perhaps holding some forgotten tiara or a string of pearls passed through the centuries. But as he reached for it, there was a strange heaviness to it, as though the box itself knew what it contained was far more than gold and gems. William opened the lid slowly, bracing himself for familiar sparkle, the kind of heirlooms he'd seen worn at banquets and coronations. But what met his eyes instead was a faded envelope, its once white surface now yellowed with age, edges slightly frayed, and yet intact and deliberate. Across the front, in his mother's unmistakable, graceful script, was his name, William. His heart stopped for a beat. This wasn't the kind of formality he'd come to expect from royal archives. No wax seal, no crest, no official stationery. This was deeply personal. He froze, staring at the soft curve of the letters, written by the same hand that once wiped tears from his cheeks. He knew instantly this envelope had not been meant for anyone else's eyes. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal, and what he found inside would forever change the way he saw his own destiny. There, wrapped in a small square of aged silk, was a ring. Not just any ring, an emerald. So dark it seemed to swallow the light, bold yet elegant, clearly bespoke. And on the inside of the band, in tiny but deliberate engraving, were two Latin words, Veritas Lux, truth is my light. The weight of it in his palm was staggering, not simply because it was rare or beautiful, but because it felt alive with meaning, as though it carried the unspoken fears, hopes, and warnings of the woman who left it behind. William could feel her presence in that moment more vivid than it had been in years, as though she stood behind him, urging him to understand. But as William stared at the ring, he couldn't shake the feeling this was more than a gift, it was a warning. A mother's whisper echoing through time. Why would Diana hide a ring with such a haunting inscription? What truth did she fear William would need to carry? The words Veritas Lux were not chosen lightly, not by her. Truth is my light. Those three words burned into the emerald's band were more than a motto, more than a poetic flourish. They were a declaration, a compass for the son she would never see grown into a king. For William, holding that ring felt like holding a secret too dangerous to speak aloud yet too powerful to ignore. The phrase echoed in his mind, unsettling him, as though Diana herself were whispering that his path would not only demand obedience, but also the courage to see what lay beneath the surface. The more he stared at the emerald, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary keepsake. If it were simply a mother's memento, it would have been stored among her known possessions, catalogued, and displayed alongside other royal artifacts. But this had been hidden away, buried in Althorp's quiet depths, rather than entrusted to the royal vaults. Not sealed behind glass, not inventoried by palace staff, but concealed in a box that only he was meant to open. The decision to separate it from the official archives was deliberate. William knew how meticulously the firm documented every trinket, every tiara, every scrap of history that could bolster the narrative of an unbroken, unshakable crown. But this ring was different, too raw, too honest for the official story. And in that difference lay its meaning. Diana's relationship with the monarchy had always been fraught, laced with both love for its traditions and contempt for its coldness. She had been adored by millions, yet betrayed by the very institution she'd tried to humanize. What she feared most was not the scandal she had endured plenty, but silence. The kind of silence that suffocated truth, that buried feeling under protocol, that taught its heirs to smile through pain rather than confront it. The ring was her rebellion against that silence. A small, private rebellion, yet one she entrusted only to William. In her quiet defiance, Diana had fashioned something that wasn't merely beautiful. It was heavy with symbolism, an unspoken warning to the son who would inherit not only a crown but also its invisible chains. It was her way of saying, "The truth is your light, even when the darkness of tradition closes in." And as William turned the ring over in his hands, its weight grew more oppressive, as if it already knew the trials that lay ahead, the betrayals, the questions, the quiet wars fought behind palace walls. The emerald glinted with a certain knowing, daring him to live up to the words it carried, daring him to remember that light can also blind when it reveals too much. Yet as William stood in the quiet room, he didn't realize another pair of eyes had already sensed the cracks in the crown of his daughters. Charlotte may only be a child, but she already understands what the crown refuses to admit. In her short years, she has stood silently between two towering legacies, full of warmth and defiance, the other cloaked in calculation and distance. On one side, the name Diana still breathes in every room she enters, a name that draws tears from strangers and smiles from her father that are edged with sorrow. On the other, Camilla wears a crown that gleams but does not glow, her presence tolerated rather than cherished, her reign secure but hollow. Charlotte feels this contrast, not because anyone explained it to her, but because the air itself carries the weight of what cannot be said aloud. From the beginning, she seemed to notice what others missed. While cameras focused on tiaras and pageantry, she observed the spaces between people, the subtle glances, the tone behind the words. Diana's memory, though abstract to her, is alive in the way her family speaks of her softly, reverently, as though even mentioning her name might shatter the fragile equilibrium they've tried to build. To the public, Diana remains an icon of compassion. To William, she is the mother who taught him what love costs when it dares to challenge power. And to Charlotte, she is both legend and blood, a connection she feels in her bones though she never heard her voice. Then there is Camilla, the woman who stepped into the story after the world's sympathy had already been spent. Charlotte senses the difference instinctively. With her own grandchildren, Camilla is said to laugh easily, to indulge them with sweets and unguarded affection. But with Charlotte and her brothers, everything seems rehearsed. Moments that should be spontaneous shrugs, whispers, smiles are instead carefully timed, measured for public consumption. In Camilla's presence, Charlotte has learned how to stand still, how to keep her thoughts hidden behind polite glances. But inside, the questions have already started to form. Her parents, though, have prepared her differently. William and Catherine raised their daughter with emotional literacy, teaching her to trust her instincts, to name what she feels, to understand that even in palaces, truth matters more than appearances. And it is that very education, that quiet permission to see clearly, that has begun to draw her closer to the grandmother she never met. In the stillness of royal events, Charlotte already seems to carry Diana's fire not in words, but in her quiet resistance, her deliberate distance from the facade. This alignment is still unspoken, just a faint shadow of what it may one day become. But even now, in her silence, she is choosing a side. And soon, her quiet watchfulness would turn into a whisper that unsettled the entire palace. Camilla earned her title, but not the trust of those who matter most, and Charlotte feels it. The weight of the crown rested on Camilla's head, but the warmth of the people never fully followed. For decades, she had endured the whispers, shouldered the hostility, and cultivated the image of a steady consort by Charles's side. To the world outside the palace gates, she appeared every inch the queen, her smile polished, her composure unbreakable. But within the walls where truth still dared to exist, her acceptance was less certain, her presence less welcome. Among those who saw it most clearly was Charlotte. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Camilla was known to lavish affection on her own grandchildren's soft laughter at garden parties, sweets slipped into small hands, indulgence without restraint. But with William's children, that warmth seemed to evaporate. What remained was a series of formal gestures and cordial exchanges, each one carefully staged, each one tinged with distance. With George and Louis, the formality could be brushed off as shyness or the awkwardness of young boys. But Charlotte was different. She noticed the difference, and she felt it in ways she could not yet name. Publicly, Camilla made every effort to appear connected, offering polite comments and occasional glances in Charlotte's direction. But those who watched closely could see that the intimacy never took root. Behind the smiles were moments of hesitation, her hand lingering just short of Charlotte's shoulder, her words chosen as though rehearsed, her laughter never quite reaching her eyes. And Charlotte, perceptive beyond her years, began to respond not with rebellion, but with quiet withdrawal. She stood near but not close, observed but rarely engaged. She fulfilled her duties without warmth, her own small silence speaking volumes. Those moments did not go unnoticed. Observers at public events began to notice the pattern, the way Charlotte leaned into her mother or her father when Camilla approached, the way her gaze shifted away rather than toward her. At ceremonies and family gatherings, photographers caught fleeting frames where the distance between them was more emotional than physical. The disconnect grew sharper with each passing year, and whispers began to circulate, not just among royal watchers but within the family itself. Even the firm, accustomed to burying tensions under layers of ceremony, could no longer ignore what had become obvious. There was a fracture, and it was growing. And in that quiet space between Camilla's crown and Charlotte's chill, an uneasy truth lingered, one that no amount of pomp could disguise. It was this unspoken tension that finally erupted in a single, unforgettable whisper. It was just a few quiet words, but they cracked the royal facade like glass. Amid the rehearsed elegance of a garden party, where every gesture was choreographed and every smile measured, Charlotte's voice sliced through the air, unnoticed at first, but impossible to ignore once its meaning became clear. She had been standing close to Catherine, her small hand lightly clutching her mother's, as Queen Camilla approached with her signature pastel smile and carefully composed warmth. To the cameras, the moment was picture-perfect, another flawless display of royal unity. But behind the thin veil of politeness, something shifted. Charlotte leaned in toward Catherine and whispered words so sharp they seemed to hang in the air, even after they left her lips. Those who noticed the exchange at first dismissed it as a child's idle question, another unremarkable moment in the tide of pageantry. But lip readers and body language experts soon dissected the footage frame by frame, and a theory emerged that sent shockwaves through the palace. Charlotte, looking straight at Camilla, had murmured, "Why is she pretending to be nice?" The words struck like lightning, too precise, too perceptive, too familiar to be anything but intentional. They carried the weight of history, echoing the kind of quiet rebellion her grandmother Diana had once dared to speak. William and Catherine's reactions only deepened the mystery. In that instant, Catherine's face stiffened, her lips pressed into a tight line, and her eyes darted to her daughter with a silent warning, but no correction. William, who had been standing just a few steps away, froze completely, his jaw tightening, his gaze briefly dropping to the ground before he forced himself back into the royal script. They said nothing. They did nothing. And yet, their silence screamed. When whispers of the incident finally reached the press, the palace issued no statement. As expected, it fell back on its most trusted defense, silence. But in this case, that silence spoke louder than any denial. Royal insiders refused to confirm or deny what had been said, leaving the world to draw its own conclusions. The footage spread like wildfire, and suddenly, the narrative shifted. What many had suspected of the thin veneer of acceptance covering decades of resentment was now impossible to unsee. That single whisper became more than a child's question. It became a symbol, a mirror reflecting the fractures that the crown had worked so hard to plaster over. Diana's voice, long silenced, found new life in her granddaughter's quiet defiance. A reminder that truth, no matter how carefully buried, has a way of surfacing when least expected. For William, hearing his daughter speak what he dared not say, forced him to confront his own buried truths. In Charlotte's words, William heard not just his daughter, but his mother. The echo of that whisper at the garden party did more than pierce the quiet veneer of the royal family. It cracked something deep within him. All at once, the decades he'd spent mastering his composure, bending himself into the perfect air, began to feel like an illusion he could no longer sustain. That single question, so simple yet so devastating, had revealed the truth he had buried for years. His daughter had seen through the performance, just as Diana once had. And that realization tore at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Privately, he withdrew. Aides noticed it first, the uncharacteristic silences, the curt answers, the way he would stare at nothing, lost in thought. He became increasingly difficult to reach, his mind consumed not by matters of state, but by memories of Diana's battles with the same cold walls he now faced. He remembered her candid confessions to him as a boy, the nights she wept behind locked doors, the way she questioned her own worth, even as the world adored her. He remembered her warnings too, her insistence that truth must always come before appearances. But in his own life, duty had prevailed, until now. The whisper reignited an impossible conflict. William knew his role, as future king, demanded sacrifice, demanded silence, demanded loyalty to the institution that had cost his mother so dearly. But as he watched Charlotte retreat into the same quiet defiance that once defined Diana, he couldn't help but wonder whether he was condemning his daughter to the same fate. Every smile he forced felt heavier, every ceremony more hollow. The pomp he had once endured out of necessity now struck him as cruel theater, and his growing unease seeped into every corner of his life. Insiders began to speak of a subtle change. William questioned protocols he'd never dared to before. He scrutinized meetings with senior royals more closely, became more guarded, less pliant. The man who once upheld tradition at all costs was now quietly challenging it. Those closest to him understood what was happening. The whisper hadn't merely rattled him, it had held up a mirror, and in Charlotte's eyes, he saw himself. That mirror didn't just reflect his own suppressed feelings. It forced him to confront the weight of both legacies pressing down on him, his mother's defiance and the crown's demands. And yet, through the haze of doubt and obligation, one thought became clear. If Charlotte could feel the fracture so clearly, how much longer could he pretend it didn't exist? But while William wrestled with the weight of two legacies, Catherine quietly prepared her own response. While William questioned the past, Catherine fortified the future. In the silence that followed Charlotte's whisper, it was Catherine who moved first, not with grand declarations or visible defiance, but with a quiet, calculated determination that would soon define her place in this unfolding storm. She understood that her husband was torn between duty and memory, and she understood that her daughter had inherited more than just Diana's name. Catherine knew the crown would not wait for them to untangle their emotions. So, she did what she has always done best. She became the shield between her family and the forces that would break them. Her instincts sharpened almost overnight. She began to control the rhythm of family life with newfound precision, becoming more selective about who gained access to her children, more deliberate about where and how they appeared. Invitations to private gatherings were quietly declined. Interactions with senior royals grew cooler, her smiles more reserved, her glances more watchful. Those who assumed her stillness meant submission misread the situation entirely. Catherine wasn't bowing. She was building walls. She also began to reinforce Diana's story more intentionally, weaving it into their daily lives as if to inoculate her children against the distortions of history. She spoke of Diana not just as a figure of sorrow but as a woman of courage, of warmth, of fierce love. She chose charities that mirrored Diana's causes. She kept her name alive in bedtime stories and quiet conversations, ensuring that her children knew who she was, beyond the headlines, beyond the crown. Charlotte, especially, clung to these stories, her eyes sharpening with each detail, her silence growing louder as her understanding deepened. At the same time, Catherine balanced diplomacy with boundaries. She maintained the expected courtesies toward Camilla in public, but privately, she drew a line that even the queen consort could feel. Visits became briefer. Seating arrangements shifted. The children were kept at arm's length during Camilla's rare attempts at warmth, not in open hostility but in quiet refusal. Every gesture was deliberate, every decision made with one goal: to protect Charlotte from the chill she herself had once felt in those very halls. What she constructed wasn't just a barrier, it was an emotional fortress. Brick by brick, she laid it around Charlotte's spirit, shielding her from the invisible weight of expectation, from the shadows of a history still being written. In Catherine's hands, protection wasn't passive, it was active, fierce, relentless. Yet even with Catherine's protection, the ghost of Diana was still alive and growing louder through Charlotte. Diana may be gone, but her presence is woven into Charlotte's every glance, gesture, and question. In a family that thrives on restraint and ritual, Diana had once been the only one brave enough to tear down the walls of silence. Now, it is her granddaughter who seems to carry that same unyielding spirit, quietly dismantling the illusion with nothing more than observation and instinct. Though she never knew Diana, Charlotte absorbs her legacy as if by inheritance, feeling it in the way people speak of her, in the way her father's voice softens when he says her name, and in the way her mother shields her from the very frost that once consumed her grandmother. It's in the fire behind her stillness, the emotional honesty she refuses to mask, that Diana's influence reveals itself. Charlotte is a child who already senses that truth is more powerful than protocol, that smiles are sometimes weapons, and that warmth cannot be manufactured on command. At royal events, where perfection is expected, the smallest things betray her defiance. The tilt of her chin when Camilla approaches, the way her eyes linger just long enough to unsettle. These are not accidents. These are instincts. moments that speak volumes without a single word, subtle but undeniable. And yet it is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. What she does is quiet, almost imperceptible to casual observers. A missed curtsy here, a glance that never quite meets Camilla's eyes there. But for those who know what to watch for, each choice is deliberate, each silence a statement. Charlotte has begun, without even realizing it, to align herself with the memory of Diana, the woman who stood for compassion over compliance, for sincerity over ceremony. Her choices are already shaped by the stories William and Catherine have woven for her. They tell her who Diana was not just as a princess, but as a woman who believed her children deserved something better than cold tradition. Charlotte listens, and she remembers. But more than that, she sees. She sees through the polished exterior of the monarchy, through the layers of performance that others accept as reality. She notices the chill that creeps into certain rooms, the strain in certain smiles, the discomfort that even the most seasoned royals cannot fully conceal. And it is precisely this ability, this quiet clarity, that unsettles them most. A child who sees what they'd rather keep hidden. A child who reflects back the cracks they work so hard to deny. Because children, unlike adults, do not yet know how to lie to themselves. And so, as Charlotte grows, the question no longer becomes if she sees the truth, but what she will do with it. The future of the monarchy doesn't sit on Charles's head anymore. It flickers in the eyes of a child. For centuries, the crown has endured because it convinced the world of its permanence, its unshakable grip on tradition. But now, within the same walls that once silenced Diana, a new tension is rising. The palace clings to its delicate balance, trying to honor the rituals of the past while pretending to embrace the truths of a modern age. Yet that balance grows more fragile with every glance from Charlotte, who sees through the layers of pageantry and into the hollow spaces beneath. Already, her instincts have begun to reshape the way royal circles perceive themselves. Senior aides whisper that she notices too much, that her presence itself has become unsettling, not for what she says, but for what she refuses to pretend not to see. At events, her quiet hesitations are dissected as though they carry the weight of prophecy. Her subtle choices where she stands, who she looks at, and how long her silence lasts have become small acts of defiance that ripple far beyond her years. And those watching cannot help but feel the echo of her grandmother, still alive in this child who has inherited more than a name. Camilla's reign, though firmly established by titles and ceremony, remains shadowed by Diana's enduring memory, a shadow that only deepens as Charlotte grows. No amount of public rebranding has erased the image of the woman who once dared to say aloud what no one else would. Diana's ghost walks alongside Charlotte now, more visible than ever, reminding everyone that no crown can completely hide the truth. And as Camilla smiles and curtsies her way through the endless performances of her role, she must know that the smallest of the next generation already carries the power to undo everything she has tried to build. William and Catherine, too, have chosen their quiet rebellion. They have stopped asking whether they can protect their children from the monarchy's contradictions. They now ask how to prepare them to confront it. Every decision they make, every barrier they build, is less about preserving tradition and more about preserving their children's emotional clarity. They are rewriting the story behind closed doors, ensuring that Charlotte and her brothers grow up understanding that the crown is not their identity, only a burden they can choose to carry or not. And that possibility lingers like a storm cloud on the horizon. That Charlotte may one day redefine what it means to wear the crown or refuse it altogether. Because what lives in her now is more than duty. It is the unspoken promise of a reckoning yet to come. Because a whisper, once released, cannot be taken back, and neither can the truth it carries. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.